Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm pretty new to this group. I haven't attended this conference in the past, so it's nice to sort of dip in and see what the conversation looks like. So I hope that I will be able to hold your attention if I'm the very last speaker in a robust 3 days. That's quite a task, but I will accept it with bravery. I don't have any slides to share this morning. I'm just going to be speaking with you, which will hopefully also be a bit easier for everybody. So yes, I'm Julie Schindel and I'm the Senior Manager for Responsible Sourcing at Levin Sources. For those of you who know Levin Sources, you're going to be like, who's Julie then? I joined the organization in January, so I am a new face to Levin Sources. I am here in Berlin, Germany, and my background for about the last 10 years has been really squarely in the space of how do companies source materials for their products with respect for human rights and the environment. But specifically, I am a human rights specialist. Prior to working at Levin Sources, I was a senior advisor at Shift, which is a leading organization on business and human rights, and also at the Responsible Business Alliance, back when they first created their secretariat a long time ago now. Before that, I had other careers in humanitarian assistance and journalism. So I've had a bit of a winding road, but always really the focus, I would say, squarely on human rights, which is also my academic background. So I guess over the years, I've managed to gather quite a lot of, rather a lot of sense of how do companies do business with respect for human rights, including in the minerals and metals sectors. Because I've been in a position, in particular through industry association and also through advisory services, to see the practices of a lot of companies, as well as governments, civil society, trade unions, other stakeholders. It's a very interesting lens to have. And over the years, I've collected sort of quite a lot of impressions about where things are going, what practices actually make a difference in terms of improved outcomes for people and communities on the ground, whether in production countries in minerals and metals, through the entire value chain, through to end of life, as we were just talking about here in terms of recycling. And I guess this morning, as I shared previously with Sarah and Rose, I was going to allow myself to share a little bit of a story arc of some of the impressions I've had over those years, not least because I've just returned to a rather focused minerals and metals space after having spent the last 5 years or so working on human rights due diligence across numerous industries. And I'm rather struck by some of my impressions thus far that I thought might be also interesting to share with others, and some of my thoughts about what actually makes a difference for people involved, whether at the mining level, whether at the smelter and refining level, transport, recycling, manufacturing, you name it, in the minerals and metals supply chains. So I'll just share with you some of my remarks now, and certainly welcome questions from all participants. So obviously we're all aware that, minerals and metals are at the heart of the just transition. And, it's been certainly interesting to see this new name, critical minerals, here in Germany. Obviously, it is now seen as a matter of national security and energy independence to make use of green energy technologies, not least because of current conflict in Ukraine. In addition to their obvious necessity to enable that transition to a greener and more just future. And so in terms of my own story, when I started working in responsible sourcing, back then we usually called it corporate social responsibility. There's all these names for these things. It really felt like for many, many companies, the focus on responsible supply chains or responsible sourcing was just getting information. So let's find out who our suppliers are, beyond tier one. That was big. Let's do a unified supplier questionnaire. Let's do a database to store that information in like a centralized, standardized format. And let's do audits to verify what is in the questionnaires. Back then, I used to give media interviews and I had to be fairly convinced of what I was saying. I felt it did make sense because step one in responsible sourcing, and this is absolutely still true, is knowing where you're sourcing from. This came up in the discussion about, I'll say, blockchain. And what kinds of impacts could be occurring to people and planet along the way. That's absolutely step one of being a responsible company, just knowing, right? What's in my product? How did it get here? So when I returned into that focused metals and minerals space in January of this year by joining Levin Sources, I was curious where the sector was. And if I could be honest, I was kind of shocked that so much of the focus still seemed to be on exactly the same actions as what I had seen when I first came in to the entire responsible business world, which was the real focus on, okay, let's do the supplier questionnaire, let's do the audit. You know, there's a real proliferation of industry standards and certification schemes, which are then audited against. And obviously in this space, some regulation that is relevant for companies as well. But I didn't still understand how all of these policies and processes actually improve outcomes for people or planet on the ground. How companies coming in, seeking to align to a certain standard, ensure that their actions on the ground are actually framed around the needs of local people and really their fundamental rights, which are framed in human rights language. I didn't see that connection between the actions companies were taking even now and improved outcomes for people. So we know that the mining sector has one of the longest track records in terms of considering impacts on communities related to its activities. It's also one of the more regulated sectors, subject to very specific requirements related to community impacts. And to this day, just about a month ago, as reported by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, the mining sector is consistently the most dangerous sector for community members who stand up for their rights. These are human rights and environmental defenders. This is a track record for 7 years as tracked by the Human Rights Resource Center, but it probably goes beyond that. And to be frank, as I'm sure all of you do also find, I find this a troubling track record after decades of efforts. And I have personally known many, many people from business, from civil society, from government, who have given tremendous efforts and investment to make the metals and minerals supply chain, including those critical minerals, more responsible, more rights respected. So obviously the question is, you know, if I'm questioning some of the actions that I think continue to be taken by companies in terms of responsible sourcing of minerals and metals, what's better then, right? What's my alternative? I can't just complain, I have to offer a solution. That's always how I've been trained, including when I did advocacy at Oxfam. As one green energy technology company recently asked us at 11 Sources, okay, fine, if we're not going to be reliant on audits as the entirety of our due diligence system to demonstrate responsible sourcing, what's the alternative? What are the other tools in the toolbox? And, you know, I had to really smile with sort of relief when I got this question. I was very happy with that. You know, it's been over 10 years, as we all know, since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights really set the global bar on what it means to do business responsibly with respect for human rights. The UNGP set out that very clear pathway for companies by articulating something that companies already do, and that is due diligence. And after a decade of efforts to implement the UN Guiding Principles and also the relief they provide in terms of standards alignment, rather than sort of playing standard soup and new standards popping up, we know what that bar is, we can drive to it. And it's aligned with OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. We also now have leading practices that demonstrate what is the appropriate role for verification tools like audits. You know, yes, we're not giving up on them, but they have a specific role. And more importantly, you know, what's the big picture about what companies can do to take steps to ensure that their products and services are made responsibly? And again, not just enforcing an outside standard on local people who maybe think that doesn't make sense for me, but really working with local people to make that product and service responsibly. I'll get on to more on that in a minute. I'm thinking back to what I heard Zach share with us. You know, I could go through a list of practices we've seen work, especially deep in the supply chain where you feel maybe as a company more downstream, well, I have no leverage, you do. But I really want to focus on one critical linchpin to it all that I've observed over the years as an absolute kind of make or break factor. And that's, I can encapsulate that in one word, and that word is engagement. So this word gets bandied around a lot. What does it even mean? When it comes to responsible sourcing, engagement means a conversation, a dialogue. In terms of stakeholder engagement, it means an invitation to discuss not just the presence of a policy or process on paper, but how it is implemented and challenges suppliers are facing to implement it, how they think about that stuff on paper and what is its connection to real performance, which is performance in this instance is actually improved outcomes for people and planet, not the existence of something on paper. And many companies say, fine, I mean, logically I follow you, but I cannot carry out a conversation with my 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 suppliers. That's the case for some of the very big downstream companies. And no, of course, that's not possible alone. But here's the power of collaboration. And I know this topic has been addressed in the previous days. So collaborations, partnerships, industry initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives, dialogue platforms, you name it. Over and over, we have seen the power of collaboration to engage, to support, to push supply chain partners to rise to the standard that we expect of all companies to do business with respect for people and planet. And secondly, but no less important, engagement is also about engagement with potentially affected people. The people who could or have already experienced abuses of their fundamental rights in connection with your business, whether in your own operations or value chain. Those of you who know the OECD multinational enterprise guidelines or the UN guiding principles will know exactly what language I'm using here. And this is about more than a questionnaire. This is a real conversation. You know, because of the pandemic, we've, I think, become particularly heightened to what is a real conversation as compared to an email exchange, a questionnaire, a please enter data in my database. And this conversation is usually held in collaboration with civil society organizations or trade unions who support and speak as legitimate representatives of potentially affected people. That's the language from the standards. Experienced companies also know that you ignore the perspectives of affected communities at your own peril. If we want to talk sort of hard knocks, why does this matter? Especially in the mining sector, we see direct ties between harms to communities because of mining projects and what we often refer to as material risks to mining companies, all the way up to the project having to close or end due to conflict with community. This research is nearly 10 years old. It is very clear it is not new. It should not be news to us that consultation with potentially affected people is a core part of ongoing due diligence and, frankly, effective business operations management overall. As a final point, I just want to share one reflection that has been particularly strong for me in the last few months since coming back squarely in the minerals and metals value chain space. Too often, I have seen human rights due diligence categorized as just risk management. And it's like that just do no harm. That's the boring stuff. We've got to do that. But somehow, you know, like the real wins are going to be when we like move the needle and do impact. And this is going to somehow be different from ensuring that the company's impacts on people and planet are as positive as possible. So I'm not the first to say this, but given how much, you know, in the last just hour, I've seen us reference something like, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to say this really clearly because I strongly believe it to be true. The greatest single contribution companies will make to the betterment of human lives on our planet will be when the company's own footprint on people and the environment is a force for good. No amount of philanthropy or bringing a useful product to market, including a green energy technology to market, can erase the profound harm companies could do when they fail to respect the rights of workers, communities, and environments impacted by their activities. So think about the tens or even hundreds of thousands of people and communities impacted by one large business and its value chain. And imagine that all those people and communities experienced positive improvements in their lives because of that company's actions. That is a huge opportunity. This is an opportunity for resilience, for being a company and a business partner of choice. And ultimately, as I think has been the focus of all of these 3 days, for companies to show real leadership in our time of this just transition. I'll conclude there and very happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julie. Round of applause from all of us here. Absolutely brilliant. And I think as well, such great words to begin to actually draw to a conclusion what's happened over the last 5 days of this meeting of minds, shall we say, and this collaboration, because I think that was perhaps one of your key messages coming through there is we truly need to collaborate, and through that really listening to one another and trying to understand where everybody's coming from. Zach, I don't know if you want to join me in on this discussion. I realize I've given you no warning at all. Do you have any reflections on what Julie's just shared with us?
Only that I think it was brilliant. I think, I guess two things. One's a slightly broader reflection around the mining industry. many of you don't know, I wear a number of different hats. One of my hats that I wear is a dialogue forum in South Africa, which is led by faith organizations with the mining industry as a kind of a safe space that they can have some of these dialogues. I like to say, I think it's quite an important piece of work. The safeness and the neutrality of that space, that it can be a place where people can come in, have real disagreements without judgment. So I think I think breaking that down and getting that right out to the community. Sorry, I'm now rambling along. Where I was trying to go with that was Julie's point about engagement and dialogue is absolutely critical. And the complexity of doing that on a broad basis is phenomenal. You know, we as miners, 2 points, sorry. The one is that as miners, what we tend to do is go, cool, I've spoken to a couple of my trade unions, and therefore I've now ticked that box. I've taken care of that. You know, and Chris Griffith, who was CEO of Platinum, he's now the chief executive at Goldfields. He drew a really simple, really brilliant graph a few years ago. We were chatting and we were talking about this problem around labor engagements, and he said, you know, we used to have a relationship between a company and their employees, and then in like the 80s. Certainly in South Africa, we outsourced that relationship. We outsourced it to the labor unions. And now the relationship looks like that. And we don't know our employees anymore, and they don't know us. And so the whole thing, you know, and so I think Julie's point of representatives of groups are not the same as groups. All right. And I think that's pretty critical. And then the second point is also to Julie's thing, but I think somebody else mentioned it earlier, is that the mining industry is painted with a single brush. All right. Often there may be different colors and different nuances in that, but often with a single brush. And the best example I can think of that recently is there was a situation in South Africa. Natasha Viljoen, who is the chief executive at Anglo Platinum, they wanted to donate money to the Red Cross towards their work in the Ukraine, a significant amount of money. And the Red Cross said, nope, we don't take money from mining companies. Now, you know, if I was going to look at a list of responsible mining companies, Anglo Platinum would be in that top little group. I mean, they really do, not perfect, but they do a lot. But because the industry gets painted with a single brush, I think it is important for all of us to be much more aggressively outspoken about bad actors and about bad examples, you know. And I think about the mining Indaba that's just happened, where, you know, several people who have a long history of questionable activities stood up and spoke, you know. And as an industry, I think we need to be much stricter around actively speaking out against these bad actors. So there's that dialogue, but there's also that conscious action, a conscious dialogue with the bad actors, because we all get painted with that same brush. Sorry, I know that was a bit of a round trip. As I say, you can journey anywhere, but you get to the...
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Zach. Julie, do you have any comments in return for Zach? And I think, I mean, one thing, Zach, that really resonated with me there is the mining sector is diverse. And do we hold ourselves to account, or do we offer the stage, the platform to be honest, the same people who've been standing on it for 20 years, which can be immensely frustrating because we know that some of them have been doing things that perhaps aren't in line with where we want the sector to be today. Sorry, Julie, over to yourself.
Yeah, I feel like you're a fellow journalist here. That's quite a good question. It still runs in my veins, this instinct. I think two things come to mind when I was listening to Zach speak. And one is a bit simpler to speak to, and then I'll go to the second. The first one is in terms of facilitating that dialogue that is so critical to actually demonstrating and enabling the company to be a true responsible business. I agree that it's incredibly complex. I have seen many, many companies, and this includes financial institutions as well, learn over the years, how do we do that then? Because internally we have no idea how to do that. And that's certainly not something that we can finance alone. And so the most successful, really practical examples that come to mind for me are when companies join together. I've seen very small groupings, I've seen very large groupings, they both have pros and cons, and get connected with people who actually understand something called dialogue facilitation. Consensus building is also a really critical byword here, and ensure that they have access to that expertise. I think companies sort of knee-jerk, this maybe comes out of the era of maybe some more legacy approaches to sustainability reporting, for example, is they send out to a list of people they know a questionnaire to tell them what are the issues we should be concerned about. And I fully understand that this does not necessarily come from an evil place. I have seen beloved colleagues do this over the years, but that's not what the expectation is. And that's not what is going to enable the company to have the perspectives of affected people that it needs to have. So that's just a thought on that front in response to something that Zach raised. I guess my answer is yes, dialogue is complex, but it is possible, and we have a track record of doing it well. So in certain instances, in terms of the second part of your question, who gets up on that stage? Do we give ourselves a pass and sort of pat ourselves on the back when we shouldn't be? What comes to mind when I hear that question is, for me, again, really the tremendous assistance that we can find in the standards set by the UN Guiding Principles. Because finally, after so many years of just sort of a whack-a-mole game of standards created by, I don't know who, I don't mean to delegitimize anybody who set a standard, but admittedly, it's a lot of bodies who sort of appointed themselves to write a standard with differing degrees of quality. I think we can all say we have a really, really robust standard about what it means to be able to credibly say, we're doing okay in our efforts to be a responsible company. And that we would actually also begin to say, okay, fine, what does your performance look like, right? Because for years, the performance indicator was the presence of an audit. How many CAPs did you close? I cannot tell you the number of CAP reports that I read that I could not credibly connect to outcomes for workers or communities. It was just procedural, but it didn't actually connect to then working conditions or water access for communities who are adjacent to mining activities that are extremely water intensive and lower the water table. So that, I think, is very helpful in terms of, to me, having a very clear standard. Fine, if we want to put somebody on a platform and say they're demonstrating some leading practice and we'd like to learn from that, or they had a huge problem, but they're starting to learn how they can improve on that situation, which is probably more the reality, that we would actually be able to have one shared view about, well, where are we trying to get to and what actually works? For me, that brings a tremendous clarity to have that, rather than sort of every conference, there's, as Emma rightly said, kind of a sexy new approach that relates to responsible sourcing that we all of a sudden feel the need we need to spend a whole conference on. I think we have learned over the years that that doesn't necessarily lead to improved outcomes for people or the environment. And that's what this is all about.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Emma. You've got Ludovine applauding away behind the scenes. Absolutely fantastic. And I think that this is a case here of, in terms of people talking, in terms of people doing audits, ticking boxes, etc. Who cares if somebody has a policy or a procedure? It's what are you actually doing on the ground? Where is that impact? Where is that action? Where is that change that's happening there? And that's the real focus point. So everyone, if I can invite you to please put your hands together for the fabulous Julie Shindle. Thank you very much, Julie. Brilliant.